Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
More Creepy Stories, Volume 3, Story Number 1. Fresh out of college, I took a teaching job in a small town in central Wisconsin. My sophomore creative writing class, I assigned a flash fiction exercise around Halloween. We'd studied urban legends and folklore, and it was the students' turn to construct stories of their own. The assignment length was about 1,000 words. Directions were, scare me. The submission quality was as expected. These are sophomores after all, but one day and one story stood out halfway through my stack of papers. A piece by a quiet student named Jake. His first-person flash fiction story seemed so real, like it was dipped in reality, a little too closely, almost like he wasn't making it up, but he had been retelling something that happened to him. I put it aside, impressed. Kate's submission was the last paper in the stack. I remember the reading experience vividly, the beads of sweat accumulating around my temples, the clickety-click of the red pen in my hand, and a weird feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. I placed it on top of Jake's story and I thought, what the hell am I going to do? I still have photocopies of the original stories, and I often wonder, why do I still have these? But there is something about them. They are so interconnected, and there is something so raw and beautiful about them. I have a strong affinity for interesting student writing, and it'd be a shame to let the flames of these stories be extinguished. I'll share the student pieces and the subsequent events that transpired right here. I do enjoy a good story. Jake's flash fiction. My parents put Grandma Rosie in a home when she started to lose her grasp on reality, they said. I still found it cruel, but she seemed content. Content enough, I guess. I remember visiting her. She had an old wooden rocking chair that faced the window. Outside was nothing but flat fields of green. The green would eventually fade, and when it snowed it was carpets of white for miles and miles. I'm not sure which season Grandma Rosie liked the most. She didn't do a lot of talking. She mainly listened to a radio, and always one station, 89.1. But 89.1 never had a signal. It was always static. Grandma Rosie listened to the static all day, seemingly waiting out her life. No one could reach her. I visited one day to drop off a box of chocolates. Grandma Rosie rocked slowly in her chair with large headphones over her ears, staring out the window watching the snow fall. I couldn't tell if she knew I was there. I walked over and placed the chocolates on a small table, and her hand suddenly reached across and snatched my wrist. Shh, she whispered, listen. Grandma Rosie leaned in close, and I put my ear to hers. I lifted up the cup of her headphone and listened. It was only static. I was about to speak, but she covered my mouth with her hand. Listen closer, she said. I did, but all I heard was more static. Soon they will come, she said. They will come to take me away. This freaked me out a little, and I went home. I told my mom and dad about what happened, but they didn't think it was that weird. I kept thinking about it. One night I couldn't sleep, so I buzzed my friend Abby on our walkie-talkies. She lived across the street, and she knew all about 89.1. She told me it was an old legend in our town, and you needed two things to explore the legend further: a radio and a closet with the door slightly open. Face away from the closet, tune into 89.1 and listen very closely. At some point through the static, you'll hear the faint sounds of an organ, distant screams, and the dragging of metal chains along a gravelly surface. The open doorway is an invitation. Keep your eyes closed, and only if you keep your eyes closed, a figure will appear and drag you into the closet. From there, your fate is unknown. How do you know this? I asked. I've heard about it, she said. Don't tell anyone. The less people that know, the better. I looked out my window and saw Abby in her bedroom. She put her finger up to her lips. This is our secret, the walkie-talkie buzzed. For the next few days, I kept thinking about the ritual and Grandma Rosie. Why would she be playing this game? Why did she want to be dragged into an unknown fate? I again told my parents that I was worried about Grandma Rosie. They were very dismissive. Ever since Grandpa died, I think she wants to let go, my mom said. She wants to be with him. I wanted to know more, so I decided to try the game myself. It was late at night, and I opened my closet door just a crack. I sat on my bed with my back to the closet, turned my radio to 89.1, and put on my headphones. I heard the static, and I closed my eyes. I sat there for a long time, focusing very hard on the static. The longer I sat there, the more it felt like my room was shrinking. Kind of like the space was filling up with something else, like I wasn't alone. In my headphones, I heard the distant organ, and I heard the screams that seemed far away but sounded like they were getting closer. The screeching of the metal began, and then I heard a voice. Open your eyes. I jumped from my bed, very startled. Abby was laughing hysterically through the walkie-talkie. I looked around my bedroom. I was alone. I looked out the window and saw Abby smiling and giggling. She brought the walkie-talkie up to her mouth. I totally scared you, she said. There's no one there. You're such a wuss. I noticed the closet door. It was wide open. The static of 89.1 hissed from my headphones. I was only joking, the walkie-talkie chirped. But I wasn't so sure it was a joke. Grandma Rosie died 2 weeks later in her sleep. Her time had come, and I was done fooling around with legends and superstitions. Jake's story was the most interesting of the bunch. His writing needed some tightening, sure, but the ideas were there. A mysterious legend, sentimental characterizations, and an ambiguous ending. I truly thought he had invented the whole thing. Until I read Kate's submission. Kate's flash fiction. Panic, fear. No one would believe me, not ever. I told him I was joking. About everything. It helps me sleep at night. But I know what I saw. A young boy, a ritual, and death. Death itself. A black death with a clutching grip, an entity that surrounds its victim, dragging a companion to its secretive and eternal lair. But I was joking. Joking all along, which made it okay. I had to know. No more. I went to a room. It felt recently vacated, like the plug had just been pulled from a sink. Headphones on the floor, static, nothing but static. Noises from the closet, labored breathing, fingernails squeaking on the door from the inside. I clutched the handle. Something else, something dark. Can't open it, won't open it, refuse to let it out. I slowly back away, a tiny voice squeaking, "Help me." Static echoing in the small room, nothing but static. I closed the door on my way out, won't let it out. Won't tell. Will never tell. My story doesn't exist, it's simply not there. It's nothing but static. Here I had two seemingly intertwined stories, Jake's more traditional folklore story and Kate's personalized flash fiction, focusing on emotion, regret, and secrets. Perhaps I'd been swimming in urban legends too long, or maybe I'd been the victim of too many horrendous student essays and stories to count, but I couldn't shake the notion. This seems real. A few days after Halloween, I kept Kate after school. I wanted to know more specifically. Was she the Abby character in Jake's story? And was she confessing to visiting the grandmother in her own piece? I pulled out Kate's flash fiction, and I asked her how she wrote it. What was her inspiration? She shrugged. I guess it's avant-garde. I was just experimenting with ideas. Did you like it? I nodded. It was an interesting piece, I told her. Have you ever heard of 89.1? Kate asked me. I started to speak, but I couldn't. A few words sputtered out, but were interrupted by Kate's laughing. Oh my gosh, Mr. Patrick, the whole thing was just a joke. Kate explained how she and Jake conspired to write multiple viewpoints of the same story, partially as a creative writing exercise, but mainly just to screw with me. The whole thing was made up. It was a Halloween prank. We so got you, Mr. Patrick, Kate laughed. I smiled uncomfortably. It was a good one, and yes, they got me. I told her that I enjoyed her piece. Let's continue developing your avant-garde writing and enjoy your Halloween. But something didn't feel right. I had drinks with a veteran freshman English instructor, me the first-year teacher in a new town, and he the wily old mentor. I told him about the assignment and the stories Jake and Kate turned in. He laughed and thought about it a bit more. That just seems off, he said. You said Jake and Kate conspired to play a joke? They were thick as thieves in my class at the start of the school year, But in the fall they stopped talking. Wouldn't even look at each other anymore. Had some sort of falling out. I guess they made up. For the next few weeks I watched Jake and Kate closely. In my class and in the hallways. They didn't speak once. Never even looked at each other. I scheduled a story conference with Jake, and I let him know how much I'd enjoyed his growth as a writer, especially his Halloween flash fiction piece. I grinned and told him that his prank with Kate had totally burned me. Jake smiled awkwardly. "We got you, huh?" he said. "It was Kate's idea." Everything was made up, he claimed. There was no 89.1. He had no grandmother who passed away in a home. All the characters and situations were straight, 100% fiction. I told him good job and to keep writing. Still the situation seemed amiss, like I was missing part of the act. Was it possible that these two were so committed to screwing with me that they wouldn't even speak at school? Or maybe they were dating and didn't want anyone else to know, so they played it cool in the hallways and in class. They were 15-year-old kids after all. That seemed reasonable. But it was keeping me awake at night. Nothing else mattered. I taught during the day, and I obsessed over the stories in the evening. News, sports, and current events faded to the background. The real world slipped away. I pushed forward. Armed with a couple of possible last names, thank you school records, I called senior citizen homes in the area. I was trying to track down my mom's old friend Rosie, I told him. Each phone call followed the same script. The receptionist went through the files and found nothing. No one there by either last name I had. I scoured the internet, and I spent too much time in the stacks of the local library. I found no folklore or urban legends relating to 89.1, and each time I felt like quitting, I pulled out my photocopy of Kate's story. She had visited Jake's grandmother. It simply felt so real. I knew it wasn't fake. In a last-ditch effort, I spent a lot of time alone in my bedroom listening to the static of 89.1. With my eyes closed and the door slightly ajar, I'd hone in on the static, and I'd listen deeply and intently for the chimes of the organ, the harsh and troubled screams in the distance, and the clinkety-clink of the metal chains. Sometimes I'd think it was there, and had just to focus a little harder, and I'd sense a presence in my bedroom about to creep out of my closet. The dark mist, waiting to drag me away. I wanted it to come because I wanted the story to be real. But it didn't come. One day at school I saw Jake and Kate smiling and laughing at Jake's locker. I walked past them and Kate winked at me. That was the clincher. I finally succumbed to the notion that I'd been had. It was over. I ended my search for 89.1. I had drinks again with my colleagues, many drinks this time, and I drunkenly told him everything I'd been doing. He found my investigation ridiculous and ultimately dangerous. "You like stories too much," he said. "If I didn't know any better, it's almost like you're trying to write one of your own. Just let it go." I pulled out the photocopied stories from my back pocket and I pressed them down on the bar, staining them with splashes of beer. My colleague picked up Jake's story and he took a look at it for the first time. His eyes skimmed the page and they stopped cold. "Wait," he said. "You never told me about Abby." I shrugged. "Abby was Kate." I told him it's all part of the game. "I wonder," he thought aloud to himself. He laid it out for me. A year ago, about 10 months before I moved into town, an 8th grader named Abby had gone missing. Seemingly vanished into thin air. One minute she was alone in her room and the next minute she was gone. Some suspected that she ran away, but there were no clues, no evidence of foul play, no suspicious or shady family members or neighbors. She was simply gone. I read Kate's piece again. My heart sank. The whole time I assumed it was about her visiting the grandmother. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe the squeaks and pleas coming from the closet were coming from Abby. Kate never specified who she was visiting or where she was. I read the avant-garde flash fiction one more time, honing in on every word just to be sure. And at that moment, everything changed. I spoke with the school administration, they contacted the authorities, and the police had conversations with Jake and Kate. It went nowhere. It didn't matter that Abby had lived across the street from Jake. It didn't matter that we had words on paper. They were just stories. The kid said, "Only stories. Complete fiction. Jake had no grandparents in a home anyway. They were sorry if they'd scared anyone. They were Halloween stories, after all, and pretty ambiguous stories at that. Jake even tearfully apologized for naming a fictional character after a missing girl. It hadn't crossed his mind. And I was now the monster for dragging two innocent kids into this mess. The staff ostracized me and the town crucified me. I was done. I left the teaching profession soon after that. I walked out of the school holding my small crate of supplies, and Kate smirked at me with a knowing glance through a first-floor window. I haven't seen her since. I didn't take much with me, but I did take the photocopies of the stories. I put them out occasionally and relive the past, and sometimes, late at night, I'll get a fire in my belly and a burning desire to travel back to that small Wisconsin town. Maybe Grandma Rosie was a great aunt that Jake's family referred to as Grandma, or maybe it was an elderly family friend. Maybe I missed something about the missing girl, about 89.1, about Kate's intentions. Perhaps I can try the ritual a few more times, just to see what happens. Or maybe it's just all bullshit. It was 10 years ago, and I'm probably the only one that thinks there's a shred of truth in these stories. I'd be wasting my time. But it still keeps me up at night. The slim chance that it's all true. And oftentimes the idea of it is something I contemplate more than what really happened to Abby and the grandmother in the story. If it is true, why did the kids write it all down like that? I don't have a good answer. I'll never have one. I suppose that just like me, they really just enjoy a good story. Story number 2. Every night, no matter the weather, something walks down our street whistling softly. You can only hear it if you're in the living room or the kitchen. When they walk by, and it always starts at exactly 3:03. The sound starts faint, somewhere near the beginning of the lane near the Carson place. We're towards the middle of the street, so the whistling moves past us before facing away in the direction of the cul-de-sac. When I was younger, my sister and I would sneak into the kitchen some nights to listen. Mom and Dad didn't like that, and we'd catch hell if they found us out. But they were never too hard on us since we always stuck to the one big rule. Don't try to look at whatever was whistling. My neighborhood is a funny place. I've lived here since I was 6, and I love it. The houses are small but well kept, good-sized yards, plenty of places to roam. There are a lot of other kids here my age. I turned 13 back in October. We grew up together and would always play foursquare in the cul-de-sac or roam around from back porch to back porch in the summer. This was a good place to grow up. I'm old enough to see it, and there's only the two strange things here, the night whistling and the good luck. The whistling never bothered me much. Like I said, I couldn't even hear it from my bedroom. But Mom and Dad don't like talking about it, so I've stopped asking questions. My dad is a strong guy, tall and calm. He has an accent since he moved to the U.S. as a kid. His family, from my grandparents, are from the islands. That's what they call it. My dad, the only time he isn't so calm is if the whistler comes up. He talks a little quicker, then eyes move faster, and he tells us not to think about it so much and to always remember the one rule, the big rule. Don't try to look outside when the whistler goes past. Not that we could look even if we wanted. See, there are shutters on the inside of every window, thick pieces of heavy canvas that pull down from the top and latch to the bottom of the window frame. Each latch even has a small lock, about the size of what you find on a diary. My dad locks those shutters every night before we all go to bed and keeps the key in his room. My mom, I don't know what she thinks about the whistling. I've seen her out in the living room before at 3:03 when the sound starts. I could see her if I'd crack my door open just an inch to peek. She's not out there often, at least I haven't caught her much. But once or twice a month I think she sits out there on our big red couch just listening. The whistler has the same tune every night. It's cheerful. Da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-dum. Remember how I said there are two odd things about where I live? Well, besides our night whistler, everyone in my neighborhood is really lucky. It's hard to explain, and Dad doesn't like us talking about this part much either. But good things just seem to happen to people around here a lot. Usually it's small things, winning a radio contest or getting an unexpected promotion at work, or finding some arrowheads buried in the yard, the authentic kind. The weather's pretty good, and there's no crime, and everybody's gardens bloom extra bright in the fall. A million little blessings, I've heard my mom say about living here. But the main reason we stay here, why we moved here in the first place, is my sister Nola. She was born very sick, something with her lungs. We couldn't even bring her home when she was born, only visit her in the hospital. She was so small, I remember. Small even compared to the other babies. A machine had to breathe for her. We moved into our house here to be closer to the hospital. As soon as we moved here, Nola started getting better. The doctors couldn't figure it out. They chalked it up to whatever they were doing, but we could all tell they were confused. But my parents knew. Even I knew. Nola getting better was just another of the million little blessings we got for living in our neighborhood. So that's why we stayed, even after we found out that for every small miracle that happens here every day, now and then some bad things happen. But they only happen if you look for the whistler. See, our neighborhood has a welcoming committee. They show up with macaroni casserole and a gift basket and a manila folder whenever someone new moves in. They're very friendly. 4 people showed up when we moved in 7 years ago. The committee made small talk, gave me a Snickers bar, and took turns holding Nola. It was her first week out of the hospital, so they were extra careful. Then the committee asked to speak to my parents in private, so I was sent to my room, where I still managed to hear nearly every word. The welcoming committee told my parents about how nice the neighborhood was. Really exceptionally, hard to explain kind of nice. And then they told my parents about the even harder to explain whistling that happened every morning at 3:03 and ended at the tick of 3:05. The group, our new neighbors, warned my parents that the whistling was quiet, would never harm or hurt us as long as we didn't look for what was making the sound. This part they stressed, and I pushed my ear into the door, straining to hear them. People who went looking for the whistler had their luck change, sometimes tragically. A black cloud would hang over anyone that looked. Anything that could go wrong would. The manila envelope the committee brought over contained newspaper clippings, stories about car crashes and ruined lives, public deaths and freak accidents. Not everyone dies, I heard the head of the committee tell my dad, but the life goes out of them. Even if they live, there's no light in them ever again, no presence. My mom, I could tell she wasn't taking it seriously. She kept asking if this was some prank they played on new neighbors. At one point, my mom got angry, accused the committee of trying to scare us out of our new home, asked them if they were racist on account of my dad being from the islands. My dad calmed her down, told her he could tell our new neighbors were sincere and they were just trying to help us. He explained that he grew up hearing these kinds of stories from his mom and that he knew there were strange things that walked among us. Some of those strange things were good and some were bad, but most were just different. After the committee left, Dad went out to the hardware store, brought the canvas blinds, the latches, and the locks, and installed them on every window in the house after dinner. That first night in our new house, I crept out of my room at 3 a.m., only to find my dad awake sitting on the living room couch, holding my baby sister. My dad held up his finger in a shove motion, but patted the couch next to him. I sat and waited. At exactly 3:03, we heard the whistling. It came, and it went just like our neighbors said. The whistling returns each night, and we never look, and we enjoy our million little blessings every day. Nola breathes on her own, and she's grown into a strong, clever girl. My dad even joined the welcoming committee. We don't get new neighbors often. Why would anyone want to leave? But when a new family moves in, my dad and the committee bring them macaroni casserole, a gift basket, and the manila folder. I can always tell by the look on my dad's face when he comes back if the family took the committee seriously or if we'd be getting new neighbors again very soon. Not long ago, a family moved in directly next to us. The previous owner, Miss Maddie, passed away at age 105. She'd lived a good long life. Our new neighbors seemed like they left and fit in just fine. They believed the welcoming committee took my dad's advice about the locking shutters since they had a young child of their own. Whatever newspaper clippings were in that manila envelope, whatever evidence, my dad never let us see it, but I imagine it must have been awfully convincing since our neighbors got along with no issues for the first month. One night, when our new neighbors had to leave town, they sent their son Holden to stay with us. He was 12, a year under me in school. I didn't know him well before that night, but as soon as his parents dropped him off after dinner, I could tell it was going to be a bad time. Do you know who is always out there whistling every night? Holden asked the moment the adults left the room. The three of us were sitting in the den, some Disney movie playing idly on the television. My sister and I exchanged a glance. "We don't talk about that," I said. "I think it's that weirdo that lives in that big yellow house on the corner," Holden said. "Mr. Tolles?" my sister asked. "No way, he's really nice." Holden shrugged. "Must be a psycho killer then." Nola tensed. "We don't talk about it," I repeated. "Let's go in my room and play Nintendo." We spent the next few hours playing games, eating popcorn, and then watching movies. A typical sleepover, but I could see Holden was getting antsy. After my parents had wished us a good night, locked the blinds, and gone to bed, Holden stood up from his beanbag and walked over to where Nola and I were sitting on my bed. "Have you ever even tried looking?" he asked. "It's nearly time." Like most sleepovers, we'd conveniently ignored any suggestion of a bedtime. I was shocked to see he was right. It was almost 3 a.m. I sighed. "We don't." "See, I can't. I can't even try to look because my dad locks the blinds every night and hides the key," he continued, ignoring me. "So does our dad," said Nola. "No," replied Holden. "No, he doesn't." "You saw him do it," I said, a little sharper than I meant to sound. Holden grinned. "Your dad locks the blinds, yeah, but he doesn't hide the key. He keeps it right on his normal keychain." "So?" I asked. Worried I already knew what he would say next, because I had noticed that my dad didn't bother hiding the key anymore after all these years, because he knew we took it seriously. "So, after your dad locked up, but before your parents went to bed, I went to the bathroom, and on my way, I may have peeked into their room, and I may have seen your dad's key on his nightstand, and I maybe went and borrowed the key to the blinds." Nola and I stared, and his grin only grew wider. "You're lying," I said. Holden shrugged. "You can check if you want. Just open your parents' door and look. You'll see his keychain right there on the nightstand." "Stay here," I told both of them. "Don't move a muscle." I hurried over to my parents' room, but hesitated at the door. If Holden wasn't lying, my dad would be angry. Beyond angry. I was scared thinking about it, but more scared of an open window with a whistler right outside. I opened the door barely an inch and looked in, but it was too dark to see. Taking a deep breath, I walked into the room. 2 steps into the dark, I froze. The whistling started, and I could hear it clearly. From my parents' room. I never realized, but they must have heard the sound every night since we moved into the house. They never told us. I don't think I could have slept through it. I stood there listening to the whistling come closer, unsure whether I should turn on a light or call out for my dad. Soft sounds from the living room brought me back to reality. "Nola!" I yelled, running out of my parents' room. Holden and Nola were standing near the front door next to a window. Holden wasn't lying. I could see him fumbling with a lock on one of the blinds. I heard a click. He did have the key. Holden let out a quick laugh. Nola stood next to him, hunched up, afraid but maybe curious. The whistling was right outside our house now. I think I made a sound, called out. I can't remember. Time felt frozen. Clock hands nailed to the face, but I found myself moving. I'm not fast. I've never been athletic. Somehow, though, I covered the space between myself and Nola in a moment. My eyes were locked on hers, but I heard Holden pull the blind all the way down so it could release. I heard the snap of it start to rise, and I heard the whistling just on the other side of the window. But I had my arms around Nola, and I turned her so she was facing away from the window. At the same time, I jammed my eyes shut. The blind whipped open. The whistling stopped. I felt Nola shaking my arms. "Don't look, okay?" I told her. "Don't turn around." We were positioned so that she was facing back towards the hallway, and I was facing the window. My eyes were still closed. I felt her nod into my shoulder. I reached out with the arm not holding Nola and tried to touch Holden. My hands brushed against his arm. He was shaking worse than Nola. "Holden," I asked. Silence. I reached past him and gingerly felt for the window, eyes still sealed shut. The glass was cold against my fingertips, colder than it should have been for the time of year. I moved my hand up the window, searching for the string to the blind. The glass began to get warmer the further I reached, and there was a gentle hum feeling back into my fingertips. I tried not to think about what might be on the side of the window. Finally, I touched the string and yanked the blinds shut. I opened my eyes in the dim light leaking out from the kitchen. I could make out Holden, pale and small, staring at the now closed window. "Holden," I asked again. He turned towards me and he screamed. Everything became a flurry of motion. Lights sparked to life in the hall, then the living room. My parents' footsteps thudded across the hardwood floor. I didn't turn to look back at them. My eyes were glued to Holden. He was pale, had bit his lips so hard there was a thin red line of blood running down his chin, and he'd wet himself. "What happened?" my father asked from behind me. I managed to swivel away from Holden and look back. He looked. I've never seen my dad scared before, but I saw it that night. In that moment, an old, ugly terror stitched on his face. A parent's fear. "Just Holden?" he mouthed to me. I nodded yes. My dad let out a breath. He looked so relieved I nearly expected him to cheer, but then he turned to Holden, and my dad's face changed. I wonder if he felt bad for feeling good that Holden was the only one that looked. There was a knock on the door. We all froze. Holden whimpered. "Don't answer it," my mom said. She stood at the threshold of the hall. I'd always thought it was a skeptic and just humored my dad about the windows and the whistler, but that night we were all believers. I noticed that both of my parents held baseball bats they must have taken from their bedroom. The knock came again, a little louder this time. "Please don't open the door," Holden whispered. My dad walked over to him, hugged him close. "We won't," my dad promised, still holding his bat. "Nothing is coming in here tonight." Thud, thud, thud. This time the knocking was loud enough to rattle the door. Holden screamed again, and Nola clutched her arms around my neck. My mom came over and knelt down next to us, wrapping my sister and me close. Thud, thud, thud. "Call the police," my mom whispered to my dad. The knocking instantly stopped. My dad looked over his shoulder at us. "Do you think?" He was cut off by frantic knocking that trailed off to polite tap, tap, tap. "Police," something said from the other side of the door. The voice from outside sounded exactly like my mom, like a parrot repeating the word back to her. "Police, call the police." Tap, tap, tap. "Police." My mom pulled us closer. "Police, police, police, police." "Please stop," I heard her whisper. "I don't think calling them will help," my dad said. "How will we know when they're the ones at the door?" The knocking came back harder than before. The door shook. Then it stopped. After a long moment, I heard the knocking again, but it was coming from our back door. We all turned together towards the back door, but the knocking immediately returned to the front door. Front to back, back to front, loud, then quiet, then loud again. Suddenly the sound was coming from both doors at once. Big, heavy blows like a sledgehammer. Then something started rapping against all the windows in the house. Then the walls. It was like we were living inside a drum with a dozen people trying to play at once. Or we were a turtle and something was attempting to claw us out of our shell. "Stop!" Holden yelled. The knocking died. "I won't tell," Holden said, staring at the door. "I promise I won't tell anyone what I saw. Just please go away." We waited for nearly a minute. Then we heard it. A soft tap, tap, tap coming from the window Holden had looked through earlier. Holden started to cry, sobbing like a prisoner watching gallows being built outside their cell. My dad held him, brushed his hair, but never lied to him. Never told them things would be okay. The tapping at the window went on for the rest of the night. We huddled together in the living room for I don't know how long. Eventually my mom tried to take us kids into my room while my dad stayed to watch the door. But the second we moved into my bedroom, the knocking came back. So loud it was possible to ignore it. I was afraid the door couldn't take it. Went back to the living room and the knocking stopped. Only the tap, tap, tap on the window remained. None of us slept that night. The tapping stopped around 7 a.m. That's about the time the sun comes up here. We waited another 2 hours before my dad opened the blinds from one window. He made us all go back to my parents' bedroom first. I heard him open the door, then come back in. "Okay," he told us, "it's done." Holden's parents came back around lunchtime. My mom and dad walked Holden over to his house, and they all went inside for quite a while. Nola and I watched him from the window. She stuck to me the whole day, right at my side, sometimes holding my hand. When my parents came back, they looked grim, but wouldn't tell us what they said to Holden's family. It was a Sunday, so we all spent the day together, ordered pizza, and watched movies. That night, everyone slept in my room. Nola and my mom in the bed with me, my dad in a chair he pulled over. There was no knocking that night, or any night since. We didn't see much of Holden or his parents for the rest of that week, but by Thursday there was a moving truck in their driveway. Nola and I watched them packing up the whole afternoon after school. What sticks with me the most is how tired Holden and his parents looked. All three had the same pallor, grim mouths, and lightless eyes. Even from across the street, I could tell something was very wrong. Holden and his family were gone before sunset. I remember what the original welcoming committee said to my parents when we moved in. Not everyone who looks at the Whistler dies, but even those that live have the light go out of them, and the rest of their lives are full of misfortune. A million little tragedies. I think Holden's parents must have looked either to comfort him if they didn't believe, or share the burden if they did. I watched Nola some days happy and young and alive, and I wonder if I'd been slower, if she'd looked out the window that night. Would I have looked too, to comfort her, to share that burden? I'm glad I don't have to find out. We still live in that house, in that neighborhood. We still hear our Whistler walking past every night. The blessings, the luck, the good things here are too good to leave. But we're careful we don't have friends over to spend the night anymore. My dad hides the key to the blinds very, very well. Not that I've gone looking. Some things you just don't need to look for.